In today's text, we have what I would say two stories and one gospel. So a little bit of context for our stories today, our scripture stories today. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7, Jesus comes to the towns of Capernaum, where he heals a centurion's beloved servant or a highly valued slave. And then he goes to the village of Nain, where on his way into town, he sees a funeral leaving, and he heals the widow's son. Capernaum, of course, is a fishing village. It's got a pretty strong Roman influence in it, as we can see by the Roman centurion in the story. And Nain is a much smaller place. It may or may not be a terribly Jewish place. We'll talk about that maybe in a little bit. And so continuing with our context with our narrative lectionary. So this story, these two stories in Luke 7 happened just after Luke's account of the Sermon on the Plain. Most people are probably familiar with Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew. Luke includes an abbreviated version of that, and it takes place on a plain rather than on a mountain. For us, as we've been following the narrative lectionary, it falls right after Jesus' sort of conflict over the Sabbath that we talked about last week. Following this entry in this chapter is right before John the Baptist, who's in prison, sends some of his disciples to come and ask Jesus if he really is the Messiah. And Jesus refers to these events, the dead being raised and the sick being healed, as evidence that he is the promised Messiah. Now, something that, we got to get across that chasm from modern day times in America and go all the way back to first century Israel, or not even, Judea and Galilee. And we have to pause and remember that Jesus is a Jewish rabbi and that Jesus teaches in synagogues regularly. It says very often in the Gospels that Jesus would speak in the synagogues. Just a couple weeks ago, we talked about Jesus reading from the scroll of Isaiah in the synagogue, as was his habit to attend them. So we need to remember that Jesus is a Jewish rabbi, that he teaches in synagogues, and there are some things that are important about that, because you see, there are some things that would make a rabbi unclean and therefore unable to enter the synagogue, let alone to read the word or to interpret the word in the synagogue. And we see those things in our stories today. One of them would be to enter a Gentile's home, especially a hated, evil Roman occupier's home. That would make a rabbi unclean. Also, touching a dead body or anything that's holding or carrying a dead body would make a rabbi unclean as well. And of course, we see with the raising of the widow's son that Jesus walks right up and touches the funeral bier. So we should talk about these two stories. Maybe we'll take them one at a time a little bit. Now, the centurion's servant story, I say servant in quotes because there's some questionable language there, or some, left open to interpretation perhaps. But let's talk about that centurion himself. You could consider him a preferred and privileged patron. Certainly the Jewish leaders that come to Jesus say that he's a good man and that he's responsible for building the synagogue. As a centurion, he's a man of power. It looks like he's maybe the Roman patron and supervisor of the Roman garrison there in the town. We can infer some things about that. The Jewish leaders that come to Jesus describe him as a virtuous man. He certainly is. It says in the story that he sent them to Jesus. And so he has influence because of his, I guess you call it philanthropy, has influence to be able to send this Jewish delegation to Jesus. So he's a man who understands power and authority. He says that right in the story. I can tell people to go and come and do things, and they do that. So he is a person of some authority. Now, Jesus commends him for having faith. I think that this is one of the ways that marks him as being different from the Jews who are in that town as well. Jesus compares him to the Jews in the story, so it's worth maybe thinking about, how is he different? First of all, Jesus says that he has faith. And in this case, sometimes I think in modern times, especially in the evangelical church in America today, we often imagine that faith is basically giving assent to certain propositions or agreement to certain beliefs, maybe adhering to a certain creed. You'll find a lot of evangelical Christians running around and saying you're not really Christian unless you believe this or believe that. So faith kind of gets tangled up in this idea of believing the right things. But when Jesus attests faith to this Roman centurion, what he's really talking about is the ability to imagine possibilities, the ability to have belief in something that he can't necessarily see. In this case, it's Jesus' ability to heal over a distance. And yet, in comparison, it seems like the Jews have less of that. Now, Jesus says he hasn't found in Israel that much faith. It isn't necessarily, he's not necessarily denigrating them, but he's certainly identifying that the centurion has more faith than he's encountered yet. And next, I think we do need to remember that he's a person of privilege, that he can command and send, and they don't probably necessarily have that authority to be able to do that. They're certainly not military Roman occupiers who have people who have to follow their orders. And so, maybe we can probably think that his ability to have faith and imagine things is because he has a lot more authority and a lot more power. So he can imagine more things. So I said there's this word for slave in here. In Luke, it's actually pretty clear, although not without its problems. The original word that Luke uses to describe the servant is doulos, which is it's a masculine noun, and it really means servant or slave. It's really pretty clear in that one. And then there's this word entomos, which means held in honor, prized, or precious. So he's an entomos doulos. He's of great value, and I don't know if in the context of the story, I don't know if we can really necessarily say that this value that he places on this slave is only for the value of the slave himself as a piece of property. Just to give it away a little bit, I think that both of these stories are Jesus talking to a degree about the restoration of relationship. And so by that context, I think we probably have to see this word entomos applied to the doulos together to be something a little bit more than just what might be, treasured property. And another complicating part is, and because of this doulos, I said this doulos, the servant or slave, is difficult for us because we just read not long ago, we're in Luke 7 now. We were just in Luke 4 a couple of weeks ago, where Jesus read from the scroll of Isaiah. Do you remember what Jesus said there? Reading from the scroll of Isaiah, yeah, I'm going to record this and put this online. Isn't that great? Jesus is reading from the scroll of Isaiah, and he brings up the topic of the year of Jubilee, a reference to Jubilee from Isaiah as he's reading. And remember what Jesus said. And as he read in the scroll, he said, he has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives. That's pretty strong language in regard to captives. And yet here, Jesus doesn't seem to be liberating the slave. He doesn't set the slave free. And so that leaves us with a consistency issue in the message and actions of Jesus. So maybe it's not quite as simple as we take at face value. Maybe we need to do a little more studying and digging into this story about why in Luke 4, Jesus would say he's come to set the captives free, give them liberty, and then he comes across a slave. And if it's just a straight up slave, and then he just heals him and doesn't do anything about that. So there's a little bit of conflict there in the story as we continue on in the narrative. I mentioned that the story is also in Matthew's gospel as well. And so it might be worth, maybe as we're considering this and encountering this little bit of conflict, what can we understand from the two different accounts of the same story? Interestingly enough, in Matthew's gospel, Jesus, or the Jew, or the centurion, does not send a delegation on his behalf. Um, he just goes himself. And and Matthew uses the word P-A-I-S in English. It's the English alliteration of it instead of doulos. Now that's a different word. Doulos and pi are different. Now, pi is a male or female noun, whereas doulos is pretty exclusively male. Um, and it also implies a child, attendant, or servant. And knowing, as I've studied history, and that helps with the context. When you're getting, you gotta get back to the first century and understand what's going on. So what would happen in the Roman army is they were forbidden from bringing family members on campaign with them when they had to go away, deployed to other countries and regions. But what they could do is they would very often have a young boy as sort of an attendant and a servant, and um, they would have the sexual relations with them. And it wasn't necessary. I mean, the Roman officers would go back home and they would get married and have families later. But there's this interesting interplay here when you start to dig into Matthew's account and Luke's account, and you try to reconcile what Jesus is saying with Luke 4. And it's not necessarily that it has to be, but it very well could be that not only did Jesus, this Jewish rabbi, go to a Gentile's house, but he may very well have gone to a gay Gentile's house. And as I thought about that, as I thought about in this story, they asked him and Jesus just went. And if this is true, if it's possibly that it was a gay Gentile's house who was in a relationship with this beloved servant, wow, how different is that from today's evangelicals who refuse to go to their own gay children's weddings? Just feels like there's a disconnect between a lot of what the church in America believes and says and what Jesus said and did. Maybe we can get to reconcile that a little bit. Maybe we need to get a little closer to what Jesus teaches and what Jesus does. I think it's worth the study. I think it's worth the time. And certainly there are a lot of people out there looking for the church to be Christ-like. So we should do that. Looking at the story of the widow's son. Now, interestingly enough, this story is only in the Gospel of Luke. And so we might want to ask, why does Luke include this story? And what is Luke trying to communicate with this story that maybe the other gospel writers haven't been doing? What's Luke's theme? What's his angle on including this story? And maybe especially as Hebrews like to pair things when they tell stories. They often get paired together. Jesus will do this sometimes when he speaks, and it's a very Hebrew way of communicating. So maybe there's a pairing going on here with these stories. Now, the widow obviously would be a vulnerable and a marginalized person. This puts her in contrast with the centurion. The centurion is certainly a person of power and influence and privilege, but the woman, it says that her husband is dead. She's a widow, and her only son has just died. So she has no husband, and now her only son has died. She's now in a very precarious position about the financial breadwinner for the home. There weren't a lot of career options open to women, and depending on her age, they call her son a man. So she's obviously not super young, middle age probably at least. Um, her ability to have any kind of prosperity or food on the table or a home to live in now is in jeopardy because of the fact that she's lost her husband and now her only son. Interestingly, she doesn't ask for help. This is another contrast with the centurion, nor does she express faith as a prerequisite participation in the miracle. You see, most of Jesus' healing miracles involve a faithful participation of the healed. Stretch out your hand, get up off your mat. So many ways that people express, they participate in Jesus' signs and miracles by expressing faith. But unlike the centurion, the widow never asks for a miracle, nor does she express faith in Jesus. And from that story, there's also this moment where the people become afraid. And the word that's used there is phobos, which is the root for phobia. I often will say that I think that scripture is misinterpreted into English when they say fear of the Lord, because usually what they're trying to say is awe or reverence. In this case, it really is the word more like terror than it is awe. And that, I mean, that seems reasonable. You just watch a dead rising television show or movie, right? And uh, the natural response to the dead rising would be phobos, would be terror. And yet they do, in that moment, they glorify God. Um, but as I did that word study, as I was digging into phobos and doing sort of working my way through the original Greek on that, I thought I had to laugh a little bit, because I thought that it was funny that this word phobos is also used in other places in scripture to imply reverence for one's husband. Um, I can see some fundamentalists going to town with that one. So we'll just not touch that at all and just laugh at it. So common threads. Okay, so I said that Luke seems to be pairing up stories here. So maybe we should look at some common threads here. What common threads do we have between the stories? Well, the gospel's inclusive, not exclusive. Do you see that in the story? The gospel is inclusive, not exclusive. Neither the centurion or the widow are Jews. Well, the centurion obviously is Roman, though he seems to be a God-fearer. He's been a sponsor for the synagogue. It doesn't say whether he did that just to be, just to have a, goodness, ruling over Palestine, the Holy Land, was difficult for Romans. There were rebellions all the time. So maybe he was just trying to pacify and appease the populace so that he could, be a good governor of that area. Maybe he really was a God-fearer. Maybe this Lord thing really was something to him. And though he was a Roman, he may have respected the God of the Jews. The widow is not identified as a Jew. It doesn't say that she's not a Jew. But if you continue to do some more textual study, it says that she's from Nain. Interestingly enough, this is the only story in scripture that mentions the village of Nain. So you can't, there's no more places in scripture that you can go to figure out what Nain is like. But I will tell you that today in the current world, Nain is an Arab village. And so it's very possible that this was a non-Jewish village. It doesn't say that she was a Jew. It doesn't say that she wasn't. But certainly there is the possibility that the gospel is inclusive and not exclusive here. And certainly we see in the centurion story that Jesus does not speak very flatteringly of Israel and the Hebrews. Secondly, not only is the gospel inclusive, but the gospel is restoration of relationships. I hope you picked up in that in these two stories. Relationships are essential to fully experiencing life. Both these stories seem to not only be a restoration of life, but of important relationships. These aren't just anybody that gets raised to life or healed. If the servant really is a gay partner, then both these stories are about restoring loving relationships as well. A major thread in Luke's gospel is the idea of how interconnected we are. And this interconnectedness becomes a foundation for social justice. You see this a lot in Luke's gospel, how community and people come together in community in these interconnected relationships. And that's the source for this social justice and salvation as life message that we get in the Gospel of Luke, that we see through Jesus' ministry. So not only is the gospel inclusive, and not only does the gospel restore relationships, but the gospel is absolutely victory over death. In these two stories, Jesus wields power over the arch enemy of life. The centurion's beloved attendant is snatched from the very jaws of death, and the widow's son is returned from death on his way to the grave. In both cases, Jesus displays power over death itself. And this is why the early church saw Jesus' death and resurrection. They described it in the terms of Christus Victor, that is Christ victorious, because Christ came and the gospel is victory over death itself. And so in these two stories, we have one gospel. Though we have two stories, we can kind of experience a single gospel of life in both of them. Luke communicates a gospel in Jesus that is radically inclusive, restorative, and life-giving. And so I think it's important for us to ask, if we're not communicating radical inclusivity, relational restoration, and abundant life, then what is our gospel? And if we're not communicating radical inclusivity, relational restoration, and abundant life, then where does our gospel come from? Because if our gospel is of Christ and from Christ, then it will be radically inclusive, relationally restorative, and abundant in life. So let us intentionally strive to be a people who embrace, embody, and exclaim the gospel of Jesus as we see it in Jesus, in these stories, in this gospel.